Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where every clue matters, and every secret has a story. Join us on a journey through Agatha Christie's most intriguing mysteries, narrated with immersive storytelling. Stay sharp, listen closely, and let's solve the case together. The mystery begins now. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Invitation. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the postman who had served St. Mary Mead for the better part of 2 decades. Miss Jane Marple received it with a mild expression of curiosity as she stood at her garden gate, pruning shears in hand, having just attended to her prized hydrangeas. "Good morning, Miss Marple," the postman had called cheerfully. "Something rather fancy for you today." "Looks important." Miss Marple had smiled her gentle, deceptively vague smile. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Most kind of you to mention it." The envelope was indeed of superior quality, cream-colored and thick, with her name and address written in an elegant, flowing script. Miss Marple carried it inside, placing it carefully on the small table beside her favorite armchair before removing her gardening gloves and washing her hands. Only then did she sit down, adjust her spectacles, and open the unexpected correspondence. It was an invitation to Thornfield Manor, the imposing Georgian house that stood on the hill overlooking the village. The property had changed hands 3 months ago, purchased by a Mr. Edwin Blackwood, a wealthy businessman from London about whom the village knew surprisingly little, a fact that had provided endless fodder for speculation among the residents of St. Mary Mead. "Miss Jane Marple," the invitation read, "Mr. Edwin Blackwood requests the pleasure of your company at Thornfield Manor for a weekend gathering to celebrate the completion of the manor's restoration. Friday the 18th until Sunday, the 20th of May. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. She had never met Mr. Blackwood, though she had glimpsed him once or twice in the village. A tall, distinguished-looking gentleman with silver at his temples and an air of quiet authority. Why would he invite her of all people? They had not been introduced, and while Miss Marple was respected in the village, she was hardly part of the social circle one might expect at such an event. The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her dear friend, Dolly Bantry. "Jane, have you received an invitation to Thornfield Manor?" Dolly's voice was animated with excitement. "Indeed I have, Dolly. Just this moment, in fact." "Isn't it intriguing? Arthur and I have been invited, too, as have the Cleggs, Dr. Haydock, Colonel and Mrs. Melchett, and young Lawrence Redding from the artist's cottage. I hear Mr. Blackwood has invited his nephew, who's staying with him, along with several friends from London." Miss Marple listened as Dolly continued to list the expected guests, filing away each name with the methodical precision that belied her genial, somewhat scattered demeanor. "I wonder why he's invited such a mixed group," Dolly mused. "People who hardly know each other." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple thoughtfully. "It is rather curious." After the call ended, Miss Marple remained in her armchair, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she contemplated the invitation. Edwin Blackwood was something of an enigma to the village. He had moved to Thornfield Manor with only a small household staff and his nephew, a young man in his early 30s named James Harrison. Rumor had it that Blackwood had made his fortune in diamond mining in South Africa, though Miss Marple had her doubts about this narrative. She had encountered enough people in her long life to recognize when details didn't quite align. The restoration of Thornfield Manor had been extensive and expensive, with craftsmen and decorators coming and going for months. The results, by all accounts, were spectacular, though few from the village had been invited to see them. "I suppose it would be impolite to decline," Miss Marple murmured to her cat, Jasper, who had settled on the ottoman at her feet, "and one must admit to a certain curiosity." Friday afternoon arrived with clear skies and the first real warmth of the English spring. Miss Marple was collected by Colonel Melchett, who had kindly offered to drive her to the manor. "Quite an honor." "To be invited, Miss Marple," the colonel remarked as they wound their way up the hill. "Blackwood seems to keep to himself mostly. Can't say I've exchanged more than a dozen words with the man." "Indeed," replied Miss Marple. "It's most unexpected." Thornfield Manor came into view as they rounded the final bend in the drive. The Georgian facade gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, the newly restored stonework and freshly painted woodwork giving the old house an air of renewed grandeur. Danoe grounds, too, had been transformed, with formal gardens laid out on either side of the gravel drive. A butler received them at the door, directing the colonel's luggage to be taken to his room, while Miss Marple was shown to the blue room on the second floor, a spacious chamber with views over the garden and, in the distance, the spire of St. Mary Mead's Church. As she unpacked her modest suitcase, Miss Marple heard voices in the corridor outside, the bright, slightly shrill tones of a young woman, and the deeper response of a man. She recognized one as Eloise Pritchard, the vicar's daughter, recently returned from a year abroad. The male voice was unfamiliar. Miss Marple smoothed her gray hair, adjusted her pearl necklace, and made her way downstairs for tea, which was being served in the drawing-room. Several guests had already arrived: the Bantrys, Dr. Haydock, and Lawrence Redding, the handsome young artist who had taken up residence in the old cottage by the stream the previous autumn. Their host, Edwin Blackwood, moved among his guests with practiced ease. He was indeed an impressive figure, tall and straight-backed despite being in his early 60s, with keen dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He greeted Miss Marple with particular warmth. "Miss Marple, I'm delighted you could join us. I've heard so much about you from Mrs. Bantry." "You're very kind to include me, Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple replied with a modest smile. "Your home is quite magnificent." "Ah, but it's more than just my home now," Blackwood said, lowering his voice slightly. "I have plans for Thornfield Manor that I think will be of great interest to everyone in St. Mary Mead. I'll be making an announcement at dinner tonight." Before Miss Marple could inquire further, Blackwood was called away by the arrival of more guests. She settled herself in a comfortable chair near the window, accepting a cup of tea from a maid, and observed the gathering with quiet interest. James Harrison, Blackwood's nephew, was engaged in animated conversation with Eloise Pritchard. He was a striking young man, with the same dark eyes as his uncle, but with a restlessness about him that suggested impatience or perhaps anxiety. Lawrence Redding stood somewhat apart, his artist's gaze seeming to assess each person in turn. When his eyes met Miss Marple's, he smiled and came to join her. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Lawrence Redding." "Yes, I know who you are, Mr. Redding. Your landscapes have been much admired in the village." They chatted pleasantly for a few minutes before being interrupted by the arrival of the final guests, 3 smartly dressed Londoners, who were introduced as Mr. Blackwood's business associates. As the gathering grew livelier, Miss Marple noticed something curious. Each time Edwin Blackwood mentioned his plans for the manor, his nephew's expression darkened almost imperceptibly, and when Blackwood placed his hand on the shoulder of one of his London associates, a thin, austere man named Simon Grant, James Harrison abruptly excused himself and left the room. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured to herself, sipping her tea and watching as the shadows lengthened across the immaculate lawn outside. She had always found that human nature was remarkably consistent, whether in her small village or in grand houses such as this. And something in the dynamics of this gathering struck her as distinctly troubling. Little did she know that by morning her concerns would prove tragically justified. Chapter 2. A Morning of Disquiet. The dinner the previous evening had been a sumptuous affair, served in the grand dining room of Thornfield Manor beneath a magnificent crystal chandelier that Mr. Blackwood had imported from Venice. The table had gleamed with silver and fine china, and the conversation had flowed as freely as the excellent wine. Edwin Blackwood had indeed made his announcement, standing at the head of the table with a glass raised in one hand and a small brass key in the other. "My friends," he had said, his deep voice commanding immediate attention, "I invited you here not only to celebrate the restoration of this beautiful house, but to share my vision for its future. Thornfield Manor will soon become the home of the Blackwood Foundation for Historical Preservation." There had been murmurs of interest around the table. "The foundation will acquire and protect historical artifacts of significant cultural value," Blackwood had continued. "I've spent my life collecting such treasures, and now I wish to ensure they remain accessible to scholars and the public alike. This key," he had held up the small brass object, which caught the light from the chandelier, "will open the vault I've had constructed beneath this house, where the first of these treasures are already stored." Miss Marple, observing from her place between Dr. Haydock and Colonel Melchett, had noticed the varied reactions to this announcement. Most guests appeared pleasantly surprised or impressed. James Harrison, however, had stared at his uncle with an expression that shifted between disbelief and anger. Simon Grant, the thin London associate, had smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes, and Lawrence Redding had studied the brass key with intense focus, his artist's fingers sketching invisible patterns on the tablecloth. Now, as Miss Marple dressed for breakfast the following morning, she reflected on these observations. There had been undercurrents at the dinner table, subtle tensions and unspoken conflicts, that reminded her of the time young Tommy Jenkins had stolen apples from Mr. Hargreaves's orchard. Everyone had known, but no one had spoken of it directly. She was fastening her cameo brooch when a sudden commotion erupted in the corridor outside her room. Hurried footsteps, a woman's gasp, and then a man's voice calling urgently for Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple opened her door to find Eloise Pritchard standing pale-faced in the hallway, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Miss Pritchard, whatever is the matter?" It's Mr. Blackwood," Eloise stammered. "The maid found him in his own study. I think he's dead." Within minutes, the manor was in uproar. Dr. Haydock confirmed what the maid had discovered. Edwin Blackwood was indeed dead, slumped over his desk in the oak-paneled study on the ground floor. A half-empty glass of brandy stood at his elbow, and there was no sign of disturbance in the room. "Natural causes, would you say, Doctor?" Colonel Melchett asked, his military bearing more pronounced in the face of crisis. Dr. Haydock frowned, still examining the body. "I couldn't say with certainty, without a proper examination. He was in good health for his age, by all accounts." "He complained of a headache last night," offered Mrs. Bantry, who had joined the small group outside the study door. "I noticed him rubbing his temples during the port." James Harrison pushed through the gathering, his face ashen. "Let me see him," he demanded. "I'm afraid that wouldn't be appropriate just yet, Mr. Harrison," said Colonel Melchett firmly. "Dr. Haydock needs to complete his examination." Harrison's face contorted with anger, but before he could protest further, the butler appeared, announcing that Inspector Slack from the local police had arrived. As the investigation began in earnest, the guests were asked to remain in the drawing room. Miss Marple sat quietly in the same chair she had occupied the previous afternoon, her knitting in her lap, but her needles still. She watched as Inspector Slack, a brusque, efficient man with little patience for the social niceties, questioned each person in turn. James Harrison was visibly distraught. "My uncle was in perfect health," he insisted. "There must be some explanation beyond a simple heart attack or stroke." "Did your uncle have any enemies, Mr. Harrison?" Inspector Slack asked bluntly. Harrison's laugh was bitter. "My uncle was a businessman. Of course he had enemies." "Anyone specific? Anyone who might wish him harm?" Harrison's gaze drifted toward Simon Grant, who stood by the fireplace, his austere face impassive. "You should ask his associates about that." When it was Miss Marple's turn to be questioned, she answered with her characteristic blend of politeness and apparent vagueness. "Did you notice anything unusual last night, Miss Marple?" Inspector Slack asked, clearly expecting little of value from the elderly lady. "Oh dear, unusual? Well, I'm not sure what one would consider unusual in a house one has never visited before," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, "though I did happen to notice Mr. Blackwood seemed particularly interested in the Venetian paperweight on his desk. He adjusted it several times during our pre-dinner drinks." Inspector Slack looked impatient. "I don't see how that's relevant. Miss Marple?" "Perhaps it isn't, Inspector. Though in my experience, when a man suddenly becomes preoccupied with an object he has owned for some time, it often indicates some sort of disturbance in his thoughts." By midday, the initial shock had given way to a tense, subdued atmosphere. The guests had been informed they were free to return to the village, but were asked to remain available for further questioning. No one, however, seemed eager to leave. In the library, Miss Marple found Lawrence Redding examining the bookshelves with apparent interest. "A fascinating collection," he remarked as she entered. "Blackwood had excellent taste." "You speak of him in the past tense." "Already, Mr. Redding," Miss Marple observed mildly. Redding's smile was strained. "Force of habit, I suppose. Death has a way of immediately relegating a person to history." "Indeed, though some legacies linger longer than others." Miss Marple paused, adjusting her shawl. "I couldn't help but notice your interest in Mr. Blackwood's announcement last night, particularly in the key he displayed." "Was I that obvious?" Redding gave a short laugh. "Professional interest only, I assure you. I have a fondness for antiquities. The idea of a private collection becoming accessible is exciting." "I wonder," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "what will happen to the foundation now? And to that little brass key?" Before Redding could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the hall. James Harrison and Simon Grant appeared to be engaged in a heated discussion that fell abruptly silent when they noticed Miss Marple and Redding watching. As Miss Marple made her way back to her room to collect her things, she paused at an open window overlooking the garden. Eloise Pritchard stood on the lawn below, speaking intently with one of Blackwood's London associates, a woman named Victoria Hargreaves. Their conversation seemed earnest, almost urgent, and ended with a quick handshake that looked, to Miss Marple's discerning eye, more like an exchange than a farewell. "Curiouser and curiouser," she murmured to herself. By the time she reached the village that afternoon, whispers of Edwin Blackwood's sudden death had already spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. And as Miss Marple settled into her cottage, she knew with quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of a much darker mystery. Chapter 3. Village Voices. The following morning dawned gray and misty over St. Mary Mead, the weather mirroring the somber mood that had settled over the village. Miss Marple was tending to her garden, a task that always helped clear her mind, when she heard the garden gate creak open. Looking up, she saw Dolly Bantry approaching along the stone path. "Jane, I simply had to come and talk to you," Dolly said breathlessly, removing her gloves. "Have you heard the latest? Dr. Haydock has refused to sign the death certificate. He's insisting on a post-mortem. Miss Marple straightened up slowly, brushing soil from her hands. I see. That is significant. He won't say so directly, of course, but the implication is clear. He suspects foul play. Dolly lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the garden to hear. Poison, they're saying. Something in that brandy he was drinking. Miss Marple invited her friend inside for tea, and as they sat in her cozy sitting room, Dolly continued to relay the village gossip surrounding Edwin Blackwood's death. Colonel Melchett says that James Harrison stands to inherit everything. The manor, the collection, the entire fortune. A rather convenient death for the young man, wouldn't you say? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, pouring tea. Though inheritance can be a complex matter. And then there's that London woman, Victoria Hargreaves. I overheard her arguing with Blackwood before dinner. Something about authentication procedures and reputation risks. It sounded quite heated. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles now moving steadily. Did you happen to notice, Dolly, whether Inspector Slack found the brass key Mr. Blackwood showed us at dinner? The one to the vault? Dolly's eyes widened. No, I didn't. But now that you mention it, I don't recall seeing it on his desk when they found him. Was all Miss Marple said in response. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village shop, ostensibly to purchase more wool for her knitting. Mrs. Elliot, who ran the shop and was a veritable fountain of local information, greeted her eagerly. Miss Marple, I was hoping you'd stop by. Such dreadful business up at the manor, isn't it? They say young Mr. Harrison is beside himself, torn between grief and fury, according to Bessie, who helps in the kitchen there. Fury? Miss Marple inquired mildly, examining a ball of pale blue wool. Oh, yes. Apparently, there was quite the scene when the solicitor arrived this morning. Mr. Harrison was expecting to be named the sole heir, but it seems Mr. Blackwood made changes to his will just last month. The foundation is to receive everything related to the collection, with a board of trustees to manage it. And Harrison isn't even on the board. Miss Marple purchased her wool and made her way to the vicarage, where she had been invited for lunch. The vicar, Mr. Pritchard, and his daughter Eloise were already seated at the table when she arrived. Miss Marple, thank you for coming, the vicar said warmly. I thought you might appreciate a quiet meal after all the unpleasantness at Thornfield Manor. Very thoughtful of you, vicar, Miss Marple replied with a smile. Throughout the meal, she observed Eloise, who seemed unusually distracted. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she passed the salt, and she started visibly when the telephone rang in the hall. You seem troubled, my dear, Miss Marple said gently when the vicar left to answer the call. Eloise looked up, her expression guarded. It's nothing. Just, it's upsetting to be so close to someone's death. Indeed it is, especially when that death might not have been natural. Eloise's fork clattered against her plate. What do you mean? Oh, just village talk, Miss Marple said vaguely. I tend not to pay it much mind, though I did wonder about your conversation with Miss Hargreaves in the garden yesterday. You seem to have much to discuss. The color drained from Eloise's face. You saw that? Merely by chance. I happened to be by the window. Before Eloise could respond, the vicar returned with news that Inspector Slack wished to speak with his daughter again that afternoon. Whatever for? Eloise asked, her voice rising slightly. He didn't say, my dear, but I'm sure it's just routine. As Miss Marple walked home, she took a slight detour past Lawrence Redding's cottage. The artist was outside, setting up an easel in his garden. He waved when he saw her. Miss Marple, Would you care to see my latest work? She approached, noting how the cottage afforded a clear view of Thornfield Manor on the hill. I'd be delighted, Mr. Redding. The canvas on the easel showed the manor at sunset, rendered with remarkable precision. But it was another painting, propped against the cottage wall, that caught Miss Marple's attention. A detailed study of a hand holding a small brass key. How fascinating, she commented. Is that Blackwood's key? Yes. Redding seemed unabashed. I was struck by its design. Very unusual. Not modern at all. I'd wager it's at least a century old, possibly more. You have a good eye for detail, Mr. Redding. An artist's curse, he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We notice things others don't. As do I, in my own way, Miss Marple replied softly. That evening, Miss Marple received a telephone call from Inspector Slack. A courtesy she suspected had been insisted upon by Colonel Melchett, rather than originating with the inspector himself. Miss Marple, I wanted to inform you that the post-mortem results have confirmed Dr. Haydock's suspicions. Mr. Blackwood was poisoned, arsenic in his brandy. I see. How very distressing. We're treating this as a murder investigation now. I'll need to speak with everyone who was present at the manor again. There was a pause. Including you, Miss Marple. Of course, Inspector. I would be happy to assist in any way I can. After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple sat in her armchair, gazing thoughtfully at the evening shadows gathering in her garden. The threads of this mystery were beginning to take shape in her mind, like one of her knitting patterns, complex but not without order. Edwin Blackwood had been murdered. The brass key to his vault was missing, and someone at Thornfield Manor that weekend had secrets worth killing for. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reached for her notebook and began to write methodical observations of each person connected to the case, alongside seemingly unrelated incidents from the village's past that, to her discerning eye, shared revealing similarities with the present mystery. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Simon Grant at the EIO village inn where he was staying. There was something about the man's manner that reminded her strongly of a case involving her own gardener's nephew some 15 years ago. A case of deception so subtle that only she had recognized its true nature. And if there was one thing Miss Marple understood with absolute clarity, it was that human nature rarely changed, regardless of social standing or circumstances. The patterns remained the same, whether in a humble village cottage or a grand manor house. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. The village inn, the Blue Boar, was a venerable establishment dating back to the 18th century. Its low-beamed ceilings and worn flagstone floors had witnessed countless secrets exchanged over pints of ale and glasses of sherry. This morning, it bore witness to Miss Marple's seemingly casual encounter with Simon Grant. Grant was seated in the corner of the otherwise empty public room, papers spread across the oak table before him, when Miss Marple entered. He looked up, his thin face registering mild surprise at her appearance. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Grant. I do hope I'm not disturbing you." Miss Marple approached, leaning slightly on her umbrella. The morning had turned rainy, offering a perfect excuse for seeking shelter in the inn. "Not at all. Would you care to join me?" His politeness seemed automatic rather than genuine, but Miss Marple accepted nonetheless, settling into the chair opposite him. "Such tragic circumstances that bring you to our village," she remarked mildly. "Were you acquainted with Mr. Blackwood? For very long?" Grant carefully gathered his papers, slipping them into a leather portfolio. "Nearly 7 years. We worked closely on several business ventures." The foundation must have been a particular passion of his, I imagine. Something flickered in Grant's eyes. Edwin was meticulous about his collection. Authentication, provenance, security. He left nothing to chance. Except, perhaps, his own safety, Miss Marple observed softly. Grant's lips pressed into a thin line. A terrible oversight, indeed. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who seemed both surprised and slightly irritated to find Miss Marple engaged in conversation with one of his key witnesses. Miss Marple, Mr. Grant. Slack nodded curtly. I need to speak with Mr. Grant privately, if you don't mind. Of course, Inspector. Miss Marple rose. I was just leaving. Though I must say, the roses in Mr. Blackwood's garden reminded me so much of the ones Mrs. Jameson grew before her accident. Do you remember, Inspector? Such an unfortunate misunderstanding about plant food and arsenic weed killer. Slack's expression was one of barely concealed impatience. Yes, yes. Good day, Miss Marple. As she departed, Miss Marple noted the sudden tension in Simon Grant's posture at the mention of arsenic. Outside, the rain had lessened to a drizzle. Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, where Eloise Pritchard had agreed to meet her for tea. The girl had sounded nervous on the telephone, but had nevertheless invited Miss Marple to visit. As she walked, a sleek automobile passed her, slowing briefly. Through the window, Miss Marple glimpsed James Harrison at the wheel, his expression grim. Beside him sat Victoria Hargreaves, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. The car accelerated again, heading in the direction of Thornfield Manor. At the vicarage, Eloise received Miss Marple in the small sitting room, the vicar being out on parish duties. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. Miss Marple, I need to tell someone. I'm afraid. My dear, whatever is troubling you? Eloise set down the teapot, her eyes darting to the window. I knew Mr. Blackwood before he came to St. Mary Mead. I worked as a cataloguer for one of the auction houses in London, where he often purchased items for his collection. I see, said Miss Marple, accepting her cup. And did you part on good terms? Not exactly. Eloise's voice dropped to a whisper. There was an incident, a question about the authenticity of a medieval manuscript. I was the one who raised concerns. Mr. Blackwood was displeased. He threatened to have me dismissed. Yet he invited you to his house party. Yes. When I returned to the village and learned he had purchased Thornfield Manor, I was shocked. Then came the invitation. I thought perhaps he had forgotten the incident or wished to make amends. And did he mention it during the weekend? Eloise shook her head. No, but Victoria Hargreaves recognized me immediately. She was there when it happened. She pulled me aside in the garden and warned me not to speak of it. I see, Miss Marple said again, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. And the key that Mr. Blackwood displayed at dinner, the one to the vault, did you happen to notice it after his announcement? Eloise looked startled. The key? No, Why do you ask? Mere curiosity, Miss Marple replied with her gentle smile. Things have a habit of going missing at the most inopportune moments, don't they? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple answered a knock at her cottage door to find Inspector Slack, looking uncharacteristically troubled. Miss Marple, I'd value your perspective on a development in the case. She ushered him in, noting with mild amusement his discomfort at seeking her advice. We've made an arrest, he stated once they were seated. James Harrison. The evidence is compelling. He argued with his uncle the night of the murder over the changes to the will. He had access to the brandy, and most damning of all, we found a packet of arsenic in his luggage. I see. He claims it was planted, of course, but coupled with the motive, Slack frowned. It all seems rather neat. Too neat, perhaps? Miss Marple suggested. That's just it. In my experience, murderers make mistakes. This feels like someone trying very hard not to. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I'm reminded of young Tommy Simmons, who was so eager to prove he hadn't taken Mrs. Ellison's apple tart that he described the inside of her pantry in perfect detail. Something he couldn't have known without having been there. Slack looked at her blankly. What I mean to say, Inspector, is that sometimes the most obvious solution is arranged to be obvious. Have you located the missing key? No. Harrison claims no knowledge of it. And the vault itself? Has it been opened? We're still working on that. Blackwood apparently had a complex security system installed. Without the key? Slack shook his head. As the inspector left, Miss Marple stood at her gate, watching him stride away. A movement across the lane caught her attention. Lawrence Redding was entering the post office, a small package tucked under his arm. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple received another visitor, Dr. Haydock, who had just returned from examining James Harrison at the police station. The young man is in quite a state, the doctor reported, accepting a glass of sherry. Insists he's being framed, and I must say, something about his manner strikes me as genuine. Did he mention anything about the vault or its contents? Dr. Haydock looked surprised. As a matter of fact, he did. Said his uncle had been increasingly secretive about it in recent weeks. Apparently, Blackwood had acquired something of significant value, a historical artifact that would change everything, according to Harrison. How intriguing, Miss Marple murmured. And did he specify what this artifact might be? No, said. His uncle wouldn't tell anyone until the foundation was officially launched. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her expression thoughtful. Dr. Haydock, would you say arsenic is a poison that requires specific knowledge to administer effectively? Not particularly. It's common enough in certain household products, and the symptoms can resemble natural illness, gastric distress, heart failure in severe cases. Why do you ask? I was thinking of poor Mr. Polk's canary. Died quite suddenly last year after someone mistook rat poison for birdseed. Such a simple error, yet so devastating in its consequences. Dr. Haydock studied her curiously. You don't believe Harrison is guilty, do you? Miss Marple smiled her deceptively vague smile. I believe, Doctor, that keys have a curious habit of opening more than just locks. Sometimes they open the door to understanding human nature itself. After the doctor left, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the lights of St. Mary Mead glimmer in the gathering darkness. The case was taking shape in her mind, but certain pieces were still missing, and she strongly suspected that the most crucial piece of all was the small brass key that Edwin Blackwood had held aloft on the night of his murder. Tomorrow, she decided she would pay a visit to Thornfield Manor. It was time to examine the scene of the crime for herself. Chapter 5. The hidden clue Thornfield Manor stood silent under the morning sun as Colonel Melchett's car wound its way up the drive, Miss Marple seated beside him. She had telephoned him early, explaining her desire to visit the manor, and he had readily agreed to accompany her. Very decent of Slack to allow us access, the colonel remarked as they approached. Though I suspect he's humoring us more than anything. He seems quite convinced of young Harrison's guilt. Inspector Slack is a most efficient policeman, Miss Marple replied diplomatically. But efficiency sometimes favors the direct path over the winding one. A constable admitted them to the house, which felt strangely abandoned despite having been full of life just days earlier. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the entrance hall. "I'd like to see Mr. Blackwood's study, if I may," Miss Marple requested. The room where Edwin Blackwood had met his end was a handsome space, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. Sunlight streamed through tall windows that overlooked the formal gardens. Despite the police investigation, the room remained largely as it had been, though the brandy glass had been removed as evidence. Miss Marple moved slowly around the perimeter, her sharp eyes taking in details: the precisely arranged pens on the blotter, the leather-bound appointment book, and the Venetian paperweight she had mentioned to Inspector Slack, a sphere of swirled blue and gold glass that caught the light. "Did you know Mr. Blackwood well, Colonel?" she asked, pausing to examine a small oil painting of a coastal scene. "Not particularly. Met him at the county club a few times. Seemed a decent sort, reserved but cordial. Knowledgeable about art and history." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And this vault of his, has anyone located it?" "Downstairs, apparently. Hidden behind a false wall in the wine cellar. Quite the elaborate setup, according to Slack. Steel door with some sort of complex lock. Can't be opened without the key, which is still missing." "I see. Might we go down and look at it?" The cellar was cool and dimly lit, smelling of earth and aged wine. At the far end, beyond the racks of bottles, a section of wall had been slid aside to reveal a gleaming steel door set into the stonework. A circular depression in its center appeared designed to receive a specific key. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Colonel Melchett observed. "Must have cost a small fortune to install." Miss Marple studied the door thoughtfully. "Yes, indeed. Mr. Blackwood was certainly determined to protect whatever lies beyond." As they turned to leave, something caught Miss Marple's eye, a small glint of metal partially hidden beneath one of the wine racks. She bent down with some effort and retrieved a cufflink, a simple gold square with the initials LR engraved upon it. "Lawrence Redding," she murmured, showing it to the colonel. "What would the artist be doing down here?" Melchett frowned. "A very good question," Miss Marple replied, pocketing the cufflink. They continued their tour of the house, ending in the grand drawing-room where Miss Marple had first observed the gathering of guests. Here she paused before a glass-fronted cabinet containing several small antiquities: a Roman coin, an Egyptian scarab, and a medieval manuscript fragment beneath a protective cover. "Mr. Blackwood's collection," Melchett explained. "Just a sampling, according to Harrison. The truly valuable pieces were to be stored in the vault." Miss Marple leaned closer to examine the manuscript fragment. The faded text was in Latin, with illuminated margins showing delicate birds and flowers. "Beautiful workmanship," she commented. "Reminds me of the Book of Hours that Vicar Pritchard keeps in the church vestry. Though that one, I believe, is a fine reproduction rather than an original." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple asked to see one final area, the servants' quarters. The colonel seemed puzzled by this request, but obliged. In the small sitting room used by the household staff, Miss Marple engaged the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, in conversation. "It must have been quite a shock, finding your employer in such circumstances," she said sympathetically. "Indeed it was, miss. Mr. Blackwood was a good master, demanding but fair. I understand he was particular about his routines. Did he have any unusual habits in the evenings?" Mrs. Wilson considered. "Well, he did like his brandy before bed. Always poured it himself, though. Wouldn't let anyone else do it. And he was very particular about his desk. No one was allowed to dust it but him, which was strange for a gentleman." "And the night of the dinner party. Did you notice anything unusual?" The housekeeper hesitated. "I shouldn't like to speak ill." "Of course not. but any detail might help find who did this terrible thing. Well, I did see Mr. Redding in the hallway outside the study very late, after everyone had retired. He seemed startled when I came upon him, said he'd gotten lost looking for the bathroom, but she shook her head doubtfully. On the drive back to the village, Miss Marple was uncharacteristically quiet, her mind clearly working through the information gathered during their visit. "Found something useful?" the colonel asked eventually. Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. "Perhaps, though in my experience, Colonel, clues are rather like birds. They're most valuable when observed in their natural habitat, undisturbed by human intervention." That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she arranged the pieces of the puzzle in her mind. The cufflink, the manuscript, the paperweight, the missing key. Separate threads that, when woven together, properly, would reveal the full pattern of Edwin Blackwood's murder. And somewhere in that pattern, she was increasingly certain, lay the answer to a decades-old deception that had nothing to do with village life in St. Mary Mead, and everything to do with the hidden secrets of history itself. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The afternoon sun was beginning to wane when Miss Marple made her way to Lawrence Redding's cottage. She found the artist in his garden, cleaning brushes at an outdoor sink. He looked up with mild surprise as she approached. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I do hope I'm not intruding, Mr. Redding. I was taking my afternoon constitutional and thought I might stop by to see how your painting of Thornfield Manor is progressing." Redding gestured toward the cottage. "Please, come in. I'll show you." The interior was a curious blend of artistic disorder and meticulous organization. Canvases leaned against walls, but his brushes and paints were arranged with surgical precision. The painting of Thornfield Manor stood on an easel by the window, nearly complete now. The manor rendered in twilight hues that lent it an ominous air. "Remarkable work," Miss Marple commented sincerely. "You've captured something essential about the place." "Thank you." Redding moved to a small sideboard. "Would you care for some tea? Or perhaps something stronger?" "Tea would be lovely. Thank you." As he busied himself with the kettle, Miss Marple withdrew the cufflink from her handbag. "I believe this belongs to you, Mr. Redding. I found it in the wine cellar at Thornfield Manor." The artist turned, his expression momentarily freezing before settling into careful neutrality. "Indeed it does. How careless of me. I must have lost it during the house party. In the wine cellar? Near the vault door, to be precise." Redding's smile was tight as he handed her a cup of tea. "I was exploring the house. Artists are curious by nature." "And were you similarly curious when you visited Mr. Blackwood's study? Late that night? After everyone had retired?" The cup in Redding's hand trembled slightly. "You seem remarkably well informed for someone who was merely a guest at the house party." "I observe things, Mr. Redding. As do you, I think. Tell me, what? Was it about Mr. Blackwood's key that interested you so much? Enough to paint a study of it?" Redding set down his cup with deliberate care. "It wasn't the key itself, Miss Marple. It was what it represented. Access to one of the most important historical discoveries of our time." "And what might that be?" He hesitated, then moved to a drawer in his desk, extracting a folder which he placed before her. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping dated 1892, headlined, "Priceless Medieval Manuscript Stolen from British Museum." "The Canterbury Codex," Redding explained, "a 10th-century manuscript containing unknown works of Anglo-Saxon poetry and historical accounts found nowhere else. It vanished without a trace over 30 years ago." And you believe Mr. Blackwood had somehow acquired this stolen treasure? I know he did. He as much as admitted it to me the night before his death. Redding's expression darkened. He was planning to donate it back to the world through his foundation, claiming he'd discovered it through legitimate channels, of course. The ultimate historical money laundering scheme. But you knew the truth. My grandfather was the museum curator when it was stolen. His career and reputation were destroyed. He died in disgrace, always protesting his innocence. Redding's voice grew passionate. I've spent years tracking the manuscript, following whispers and rumors. When I heard Blackwood was establishing a foundation for historical treasures, I suspected. When I learned he'd purchased Thornfield Manor, with its ancient cellars and hidden spaces, I was certain. So you took a cottage nearby to watch him? Yes. Redding seemed almost relieved to confess. And I was right. But I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I confronted him that night. Yes. I demanded he acknowledge the theft, clear my grandfather's name. He laughed at me. Miss Marple studied him thoughtfully. And the key? Did you take it? No. Though I'll admit I wanted to open the vault and expose the truth. He ran a hand through his hair. But Blackwood still had it when I left his study. He was placing it in that ridiculous paperweight, a hollow glass globe. Said it amused him to hide things in plain sight. This revelation caused Miss Marple's eyebrows to rise slightly. I see. Most interesting. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. Lawrence Redding's story had the ring of truth, or at least partial truth, but it opened new questions even as it answered others. Her next stop was the vicarage, where she found Eloise Pritchard alone in the garden, clipping roses. Miss Marple, the young woman greeted her nervously. Have you heard? They've denied Mr. Harrison bail. The police are saying the case against him is overwhelming. Yet you don't seem convinced of his guilt, Miss Marple observed mildly. Eloise bit her lip. I don't know what to think anymore. Perhaps it might help to speak the full truth. My dear, about your relationship with Victoria Hargreaves, for instance. The secateurs Eloise had been holding clattered to the ground. How did you— The handshake I observed between you was not merely a farewell. It was an exchange, something passing from her hand to yours. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. And then there's the matter of the medieval manuscript fragment on display. At Thornfield Manor, Eloise's face had gone quite pale. You don't understand. Victoria and we were trying to prevent a terrible injustice. By committing another? No, Eloise exclaimed. We never meant— It wasn't supposed to. She trailed off, looking suddenly younger and more vulnerable. Miss Marple stepped closer, patting the girl's arm. My dear, I have lived a long time in this world. I have seen good people make grievous errors when they believe they're serving a greater good. But secrets have a way of festering, like wounds that never heal properly. Tears welled in Eloise's eyes. What should I do? Tell me everything, Miss Marple said simply. Begin with the Canterbury Codex. As Eloise spoke, her words tumbling out in a rush of relief and fear, Miss Marple listened intently. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The manuscript, the key, the poison, the paperweight, the relationships between the various players in this drama of greed, ambition, and ancient wrongs seeking redress. By the time she returned to her cottage that evening, Miss Marple knew what she must do. She telephoned Inspector Slack, requesting his presence the following morning at Thornfield Manor. I believe, she said, it is time to open Mr. Blackwood's vault. She turned to Dr. Haydock. "Would you please share your findings about the particular nature of the arsenic used, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "Yes. Well, it was an unusual compound, not the common household variety. A specific formulation, used in art conservation to treat certain insect infestations in wooden artifacts and frames. A formulation that would be readily available to someone in your position at the auction house, Miss Hargreaves," Miss Marple concluded. "Someone with expertise in the conservation of historical documents and artifacts." Victoria Hargreaves's composure finally shattered. He was going to ruin everything. 30 years of building a reputation, a career, a life, all to be destroyed because Edwin suddenly developed a conscience in his old age. "Victoria!" Simon Grant moved toward her, but Inspector Slack blocked his path. "He promised me," Victoria continued, her voice rising with emotion. "When we arranged the theft all those years ago, he promised me the codex would never resurface. He would enjoy it privately, and I would build my career authenticating the remaining pages, which would mysteriously surface in private collections over the years. It was perfect, until he decided to create this ridiculous foundation and return the codex to the world." Colonel Melchett looked stunned. "Are you actually confessing to murder, Miss Hargreaves?" A strange calm seemed to settle over Victoria. "The great irony is that I didn't come here intending to kill him. I came to reason with him, to remind him of our arrangement. But he was immovable, said it was time to set things right, as if returning the manuscript would erase the damage done to those falsely accused." She laughed bitterly. "When reasoning failed, I simply adjusted his brandy." As Inspector Slack moved to arrest Victoria Hargreaves, Miss Marple watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The truth had emerged, as it inevitably must, but she took no pleasure in the human tragedy that accompanied it. Later, as they left the manor, Colonel Melchett remarked, "Remarkable work, Miss Marple, but how did you know the key was in the paperweight?" "I didn't initially," she admitted. "But Mr. Blackwood was the sort of man who enjoyed small games and puzzles, and I remembered how he kept adjusting that paperweight during drinks before dinner, as if ensuring it was positioned just so. The perfect hiding place, as Mr. Redding unwittingly confirmed." The colonel shook his head in admiration. "And Harrison? He'll be released immediately, of course." "Yes, though I fear the young man has some difficult decisions ahead regarding his uncle's legacy, particularly that manuscript." As they reached the bottom of the drive, Miss Marple gazed back at Thornfield Manor, standing proud on its hill. Houses, like people, she reflected, often contained hidden chambers where secrets lay dormant, waiting for the right key to release them into the light of day. Chapter 7. Opening the vault morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary Mead's Church as Miss Marple knelt in prayer. She was not, strictly speaking, praying for guidance. Her mind had already determined the path forward, but rather for the wisdom to present the truth in a way that might bring justice without unnecessary suffering. An hour later, she stood in the entrance hall of Thornfield Manor alongside Inspector Slack, Colonel Melchett, and a locksmith who had been summoned from the nearby town. Dr. Haydock was there, too, at Miss Marple's specific request, as were Simon Grant and Victoria Hargreaves, who had been asked to remain in the village during the investigation. "I still don't understand why you insisted on this gathering, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said with barely concealed impatience. "The case against Harrison is solid." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but I believe what lies in Mr. Blackwood's vault may shed new light on his murder. Shall we proceed?" They made their way down to the cellar, where the steel door of the vault gleamed in the dim light. Miss Marple approached Blackwood's desk, which had been moved to the cellar at her request. On it sat the Venetian paperweight, a sphere of swirled blue and gold glass. Mr. Blackwood was a man who enjoyed small deceptions, Miss Marple explained, lifting the paperweight. He took pleasure in, as Mr. Redding put it, hiding things in plain sight. With surprising deftness, she twisted the top half of the glass sphere, which separated with a soft click. Inside, nestled in a circular depression, lay the small brass key that Edwin Blackwood had displayed on the night of his death. A murmur of surprise ran through the assembled group. "It was there all along?" Slack exclaimed. "Hidden where one might look but not see," Miss Marple confirmed, handing the key to the locksmith. "Much like the truth in this case, I fear." The locksmith approached the vault door, inserted the key into the circular depression, and turned it with precision. There was a series of metallic clicks, and then the heavy door swung slowly open. Inside was a climate-controlled room lined with shelves and display cases. The group entered cautiously, led by Inspector Slack. The contents were indeed remarkable. Artifacts and documents from various historical periods, each in its own protective housing. But it was the central display case that drew everyone's attention. Inside, on a velvet cushion, lay a medieval manuscript bound in leather, its pages visible through the glass cover. Even to the untrained eye, it was clearly ancient and of extraordinary quality. "The Canterbury Codex," Simon Grant breathed, his voice hushed with reverence or fear. It was difficult to discern which. "So it is true," Victoria Hargreaves said. "He actually had it." Miss Marple moved to stand beside the case, her gentle face unusually stern. "Mr. Blackwood's prized possession, A2 manuscript stolen from the British Museum 33 years ago, a theft that destroyed careers and lives." Inspector Slack frowned deeply. "Are you suggesting that Blackwood's murder was connected to this stolen artifact?" "I am not merely suggesting it, Inspector. I am stating it as fact." Miss Marple turned to face the assembled group. "Mr. Blackwood was killed because he intended to reveal the existence of the Codex through his foundation. But in doing so, he would have exposed decades of deception and the complicity of others in keeping the theft hidden." Victoria Hargreaves stepped forward, her elegant composure cracking slightly. "You can't possibly know." "But I do, Miss Hargreaves. You see, Eloise Pritchard has told me everything." A tense silence fell over the vault. When Miss Pritchard worked at Sotheby's, she recognized a page from the Codex that Mr. Blackwood had submitted for authentication. She raised concerns, as was proper. But instead of investigating, the auction house, specifically you, Miss Hargreaves, silenced her. Because you knew exactly where that page had come from, and who had been involved in its theft and subsequent disappearance. Victoria's face had gone pale. "That's absurd, is it? Then why did you come to St. Mary Mead as soon as you learned that Eloise was among the guests at Thornfield Manor? Why did you pass her a note in the garden warning her to keep silent?" Simon Grant's thin face had taken on a calculating expression. "Victoria, perhaps we should—" "Be silent, Simon," she snapped. "This elderly village gossip has no proof of anything." Miss Marple smiled her deceptively mild smile. "On the contrary, I have Eloise's testimony. I have the note you passed her, which she preserved. And most damning of all, I have the analysis of the poison used to kill Edwin Blackwood." Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The next day dawned clear and bright, at odds with the somber mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. News of Victoria Hargreaves's arrest had spread quickly. and the village buzzed with the kind of subdued excitement that accompanies the resolution of a shocking crime. Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful as she tended to her garden, her mind still turning over certain aspects of the case that troubled her. The telephone rang just before noon, Inspector Slack requesting her presence at the police station. James Harrison had been released, and there were matters to discuss. Upon her arrival, Miss Marple found not only Inspector Slack and Colonel Melchett, but also James Harrison, Lawrence Redding, and, surprisingly, Simon Grant, who sat stiffly in a corner chair, his thin face impassive. "Miss Marple," Slack greeted her with newfound respect. "Thank you for coming. We have a situation." "Victoria Hargreaves has retracted her confession," Colonel Melchett explained. "Claims she made it under duress and emotional distress." "I-t-see," Miss Marple said quietly, settling into a chair. "And has she offered an alternative explanation for her words in the vault?" "Says she was protecting someone," Slack replied, his tone skeptical. "Won't say who, but her solicitor is making quite a fuss." Miss Marple's gaze traveled around the room, settling briefly on each face. James Harrison looked exhausted but relieved, the dark circles under his eyes testament to his nights in custody. Lawrence Redding watched the proceedings with the detached interest of an artist observing a scene he might later paint. And Simon Grant? His composed expression revealed nothing, but his fingers drummed an irregular pattern on the arm of his chair. "I wonder," Miss Marple said carefully, "if I might have a private word with Mr. Grant." Slack looked surprised, but nodded. "You can use my office. We'll wait here." In the cramped office, Miss Marple took a seat across from Grant, who met her gaze with cool assessment. "You want to know if I was involved?" he stated flatly. "I believe I already know the answer." "To that, Mr. Grant," Miss Marple replied mildly. "What interests me is why Miss Hargreaves would suddenly recant her confession. Unless, of course, she has something, or someone, she values more than her own freedom." A flicker of emotion crossed Grant's face. So brief it might have been, missed by someone less observant than Miss Marple. "Victoria and I have been colleagues for many years," he said carefully. "More than colleagues, I think. The way she looked at you when she said, 'We arranged the theft,' there was a lifetime of shared secrets in that glance." Grant's composure slipped slightly. "You're remarkably perceptive, Miss Marple." "It comes from a lifetime of observing human nature, Mr. Grant. So often, people reveal their truest selves in the smallest of gestures." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, did you know she intended to poison Mr. Blackwood?" "No." Grant's response was immediate and forceful. "I knew she planned to confront him, to persuade him to abandon the foundation idea. But murder?" He shook his head. "Victoria acted alone in that. Yet you said nothing when you learned of it. What would you have had me do? Turn in the woman I've loved for 30 years? The woman who has stood by me through everything?" Emotion cracked through his controlled facade. "We were young curators when it happened. The theft. Ambitious, reckless. Edwin approached us with the plan. We would authenticate the occasional discovered page from the codex over the years, building our reputations. He would finance our careers. It seemed perfect. Until Mr. Blackwood decided to confess." Grant nodded slowly. He'd grown sentimental in his old age, talked of making amends, clearing the name of the curator who'd been blamed. "We stood to lose everything." Miss Marple studied him thoughtfully. "Including Lawrence Redding's grandfather, I presume?" Grant's head snapped up in surprise. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple continued gently. I've pieced that part together. The curator disgraced by the theft was Mr. Redding's grandfather. That's why Mr. Blackwood invited the young man to Thornfield Manor, isn't it? He planned to tell him the truth, to offer some form of redemption. Edwin always did have a flair for the dramatic, Grant muttered. Wanted to stage a grand revelation, the return of the Codex, the clearing of innocent names, his own magnanimous philanthropy on display, at the cost of your and Miss Hargreaves's reputations. Yes, Grant's voice hardened. After decades of building our lives, our careers, our standing in the academic community, all to be sacrificed for Edwin's late-in-life attack of conscience. Miss Marple sat silent for a moment, weighing her next words carefully. Mr. Grant, I believe you know more about that night than you've admitted. More, perhaps, than even Miss Hargreaves knows you know. Grant's face remained expressionless, but his hand, resting on the desk, curled into a tight fist. The arsenic used to poison Mr. Blackwood, Miss Marple continued, was indeed a specialized formulation used in art conservation. But according to Dr. Haydock's more detailed analysis, it contained a specific compound used primarily in paper conservation. Miss Hargreaves's specialty is paintings and wooden artifacts. What are you suggesting? That while Miss Hargreaves may have administered the poison, she did not procure it. Someone with access to paper conservation materials provided it. Someone who perhaps anticipated her actions and facilitated them, without explicitly agreeing to murder. Grant's gaze dropped to his hands. You cannot prove any of this. Perhaps not in a court of law, Miss Marple agreed, but in the court of one's own conscience. That is another matter entirely. She rose, slowly. I shall tell Inspector Slack that our conversation was inconclusive. What you choose to do with the information I've shared is, of course, entirely up to you. But I would suggest, Mr. Grant, that allowing someone you love to shoulder the entire burden of a crime in which you were complicit is a poor foundation for whatever future you imagine together. As she reached for the door handle, Grant's voice stopped her. Miss Marple. She turned. You knew from the beginning, didn't you, that it wasn't Harrison? Miss Marple smiled her gentle, deceptively vague smile. Let us say that the arsenic in his luggage was rather too convenient. In my experience, Mr. Grant, real guilt is rarely so tidily packaged. When they returned to the others, Miss Marple noticed a subtle change in Simon Grant's demeanor, a resignation in his shoulders, a new resolve in his eyes. She was not surprised when, an hour later, he requested a formal interview with Inspector Slack, alone. As she left the police station, Lawrence Redding fell into step beside her. Is it true? He asked quietly. About my grandfather? I believe so, yes, though proof may be more complex than truth, Mr. Redding. All these years, his voice caught. All these years, I thought, the past has a way of reaching into the present, for good or ill, Miss Marple said gently. But what we choose to do with its lessons, that remains in our hands. She left him standing thoughtfully on the village green, his artist's eyes seeing, perhaps for the first time, beyond the surface of things to the complex patterns of human weakness and strength that lay beneath. Chapter 9. The revelation, the vicarage drawing room was an unlikely setting for the final unraveling of a murder case. Yet it was here that Miss Marple had arranged to meet with those most closely connected to Edwin Blackwood's death. Colonel Melchett had raised an eyebrow at her request, but had ultimately agreed, persuading Inspector Slack to delay formal proceedings for a few hours. As afternoon sun streamed through the leaded windows, casting diamond patterns on the worn carpet, Miss Marple sat in a straight-backed chair, her knitting resting in her lap. Around her were gathered James Harrison, Lawrence Redding, Eloise Pritchard, and Dr. Haydock. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, his expression betraying impatience barely held in check. "I've asked you all here," Miss Marple began, "because each of you has played a part in this tragic affair, whether knowingly or not. And I believe you deserve to understand how the pieces fit together." Simon Grant has confessed to complicity. "In Victoria Hargreaves's crime," Slack announced, unable to contain himself, "says he provided the poison knowing her intent. Case closed, as far as I'm concerned." "Yes, Inspector. The immediate matter of Mr. Blackwood's murder has indeed been resolved," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But the events that led to it stretch back over 30 years. A web of deception that culminated in that fatal glass of brandy." She turned to Lawrence Redding. "It begins, I think, with your grandfather, Mr. Redding, a dedicated curator at the British Museum, falsely accused of negligence, if not outright complicity, in the theft of the Canterbury Codex in 1892. Redding nodded grimly, a brilliant scholar reduced to poverty and obscurity. He died still protesting his innocence. An innocence that Edwin Blackwood knew to be absolute, Miss Marple continued, because he himself had orchestrated the theft, with the assistance of two ambitious young curators, Victoria Hargreaves and Simon Grant. Eloise Pritchard leaned forward. "But why would the museum not investigate more thoroughly? Surely there would have been evidence." "The investigation was quietly limited in scope," Miss Marple explained. "The museum trustees were eager to avoid scandal, and certain influential parties had an interest in ensuring that the theft remained unsolved." "My uncle had powerful friends even then," James Harrison said quietly. "He often hinted at connections in government, in finance." "Precisely." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting, a habit that helped order her thoughts. "For 3 decades the conspiracy remained intact. Mr. Blackwood enjoyed his ill-gotten treasure privately, while occasionally allowing Miss Hargreaves and Mr. Grant to discover and authenticate individual pages, building their scholarly reputations. Until I recognized a page from the Codex at the auction house," Eloise interjected. "I'd studied medieval manuscripts at university. The distinctive illumination style was unmistakable. And rather than being rewarded for your diligence, you were silenced," Miss Marple observed. "Miss Hargreaves ensured you were discredited professionally, forcing you to return to St. Mary Mead in seeming disgrace." Inspector Slack frowned. "What changed? Why did Blackwood suddenly decide to create this foundation after hiding the manuscript for decades?" Miss Marple looked to James Harrison, who sighed deeply. "My uncle was diagnosed with a terminal heart condition 3 months ago," he revealed. "The doctors gave him a year, perhaps less. I believe it altered his perspective." "Yes," Miss Marple nodded. "Facing mortality often prompts reflection." Mr. Blackwood began to consider his legacy, not merely his wealth or possessions, but how he would be remembered. The foundation was to be his atonement. "But why invite us all here?" "Lawrence," Redding asked, "why not simply announce the foundation and be done with it?" "Because Mr. Blackwood had a theatrical streak," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "He wanted witnesses for his grand gesture of redemption. You, Mr. Redding, to see your grandfather's name cleared. Miss Pritchard, whose scholarly integrity would be vindicated. Mr. Harrison, to carry on the foundation's work. And, of course, Miss Hargreaves and Mr. Grant, to face the consequences of their decades-long deception." Dr. Haydock shook his head wonderingly. "And the key. that brass key he made such a display of at dinner. Was that all part of the theater, too? Not entirely, Miss Marple replied. The key was genuine and necessary to access the vault, but displaying it so prominently, announcing its importance, that was both vanity and calculation. Mr. Blackwood was setting the stage for his revelation, building anticipation, and simultaneously signing his own death warrant, Colonel Melchett observed grimly. Miss Marple nodded. Miss Hargreaves realized that night that Blackwood truly intended to go through with his plan. After dinner, she and Mr. Grant conferred. He provided her with the specialized arsenic from the paper conservation supplies. She added it to the brandy that Mr. Blackwood habitually drank before bed. "But how did you know it wasn't Harrison?" Inspector Slack demanded. "The arsenic in his luggage was planted, obviously," Miss Marple replied, "most likely by Mr. Grant after the murder. While confusion still reigned in the household, it was too convenient, too neat. And Mr. Harrison had no knowledge of conservation, chemicals, while both Miss Hargreaves and Mr. Grant did." "And the key?" James Harrison asked. "After my uncle was killed?" "Hidden in the paperweight on his desk," Miss Marple explained. Mr. Blackwood had a habit of concealing valuable small items inside it, a fact Miss Hargreaves likely knew from their long association. After poisoning his brandy, she waited until he had retired to his study, then followed to ensure he had consumed the fatal drink. Seeing him weakening, she demanded the key to the vault. "To destroy the codex?" Lawrence Redding asked, horrified. "No," Miss Marple shook her head. "To secure it. The manuscript was too valuable to destroy, and too incriminating if found in her possession. She needed time to plan its disappearance. But Mr. Blackwood, even dying, refused to surrender the key. Instead, he hid it in the paperweight, his final defiant act. Miss Hargreaves searched frantically, but couldn't find it before she had to leave the study to avoid discovery. Eloise looked troubled. "The note Victoria passed me in the garden. She was warning me to stay silent about recognizing the manuscript page. She thought I might connect her to the death." "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed. "You represented a loose end in her carefully constructed narrative, one that might unravel everything if you spoke up." Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. "And now? What happens to the codex?" "It will be returned to the British Museum," James Harrison stated firmly, "along with a full account clearing Mr. Redding's grandfather of any wrongdoing. My uncle's instructions for the Foundation were quite specific on that point. I found them in his papers after my release." As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting complete. Lawrence Redding paused by her chair. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "About the paperweight? About all of it?" Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. "Human nature, Mr. Redding. It doesn't change, whether in a village like St. Mary Mead or in the rarefied world of museums and artifacts. Pride, fear, greed, conscience. They leave patterns as distinctive as the illuminations in your grandfather's codex. One merely needs to learn to recognize them." Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, casting long shadows across the vicarage garden. The case was solved, yet Miss Marple felt the familiar bitter sweetness that accompanied such resolutions. Justice served, but at the cost of further suffering. Still, truth had its own value, its own necessity. And sometimes, she reflected as she gathered her things to leave, the most valuable truths were hidden in plain sight, like a key inside a paperweight, waiting for the right person to see beyond the obvious. After the doctor departed, Miss Marple took an evening constitutional through the village. Her path led her past the churchyard, where she paused, contemplating the centuries of St. Mary Mead history represented by the weathered headstones. So many lives, so many secrets, some revealed, others taken to the grave. As she turned to leave, she noticed Lawrence Redding sitting on a bench nearby, sketching pad in hand, pencil moving swiftly across the paper. "Mr. Redding," she greeted him, "I didn't expect to find you still in the village." He looked up, his artist's gaze sharp but no longer haunted. "Miss Marple, I'm leaving tomorrow. London calls with new commissions, but I wanted one last sketch of the church spire, for remembrance." "I saw your photograph in the Times," she said. "The return of the Codex must bring you some measure of peace." "More than I anticipated," he admitted, "though it doesn't restore my grandfather's lost years or mend all that was broken." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Justice rarely does, but it offers a foundation for what comes next." Redding studied her for a moment. "You knew, didn't you? From very early on. Not just about Victoria and Simon, but about my grandfather's connection to it all." "I suspected," Miss Marple corrected, "when you spoke of the Codex with such personal intensity. And then there was your painting of the key, extraordinarily detailed for something you'd glimpsed only briefly at dinner. It suggested a deeper interest, a personal stake. My entire life has been shaped by that theft, by my family's disgrace. I came to St. Mary Mead hunting answers, never imagining I would find them through a murder investigation." He shook his head wonderingly. "Or that an elderly lady from the village would unravel a conspiracy that spanned decades." Miss Marple smiled her gentle, deceptively vague smile. "Age brings its own perspective, Mr. Redding. One sees patterns, repeat, behaviors recur. The settings may change, but people remain fundamentally the same." As dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple continued her walk home. The evening was peaceful, the distant church bells marking the hour with familiar precision. Tomorrow would bring its own small dramas, its own village intrigues, the rhythm of life in St. Mary Mead, continuing as it had for generations. Yet she knew that beneath the tranquil surface of even the most ordinary existence, complex human emotions continued their eternal dance, love and hate, greed and generosity, truth and deception. In mansions and cottages alike, people guarded their secrets, cherished their dreams, and sometimes, when conscience dictated, found the courage to unlock doors long kept sealed. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, breathing in the scent of her roses. The Blackwood case was closed. Justice served as well as circumstances allowed. But human nature, that endless puzzle, would always offer new mysteries to solve, new patterns to discern. And in that, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, lay the true interest of life. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. 3 weeks after Edwin Blackwood's murder, St. Mary Mead had begun to settle back into its customary rhythms. Gardens were tended, afternoon teas were arranged, and the daily business of village life continued with an outward appearance of normalcy. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, ripples from recent events continued to spread. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the warm June sunshine while reading the morning newspaper. The headline caught her attention immediately. Canterbury Codex, returned to British Museum after 3 decades. Below was a photograph of James Harrison formally presenting the manuscript to the museum director, with Lawrence Redding standing solemnly beside them. "Quite a satisfactory conclusion," she murmured to herself, adjusting her spectacles. The creak of her garden gate announced a visitor, Dolly Bantry, breathless with excitement as always. Jane, have you seen the Times? It's all there. The whole story about the Codex. They've even included a formal apology to the family of the curator who was wrongfully blamed. Dolly settled into the garden chair opposite Miss Marple. Though they've been rather delicate about mentioning Blackwood's role in the original theft. I imagine James Harrison negotiated that particular point. Miss Marple replied, a natural desire to protect the family name while still ensuring justice is done. And what about the trial? Have you heard anything from Colonel Melchett? Miss Marple nodded. Victoria Hargreaves and Simon Grant have both pleaded guilty. Their sentencing is next month. I understand they've provided a complete account of the conspiracy dating back to 1892. Such a tangle of deception, Dolly sighed. And all for what? A book, in the end. Not merely a book, Dolly, Miss Marple corrected gently. A priceless piece of our cultural heritage. But more than that, it represented power, prestige, the ability to shape history itself. Some find such temptations irresistible. They sat in companionable silence for a moment until Dolly remembered another piece of village news. Did you know that Eloise Pritchard has been offered a position at the British Museum? Something to do with manuscript authentication. The vicar is beside himself with pride. How wonderful for her, Miss Marple said with genuine pleasure. A fitting recognition of her scholarly integrity. And that artist, Redding, he's been commissioned to paint a portrait of the museum director. Quite a turn of fortune for him as well. As Dolly departed, promising to return for tea the following day, Miss Marple contemplated how a single act, Edwin, Blackwood's decision to reveal the truth about the Codex, had altered so many lives, creating both justice and opportunity where before there had been only festering secrets. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Haydock's car pulled up outside her cottage, and he emerged carrying a small package. Miss Marple, he greeted her warmly. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Doctor. Would you care for some tea? As they settled in her sitting room, Dr. Haydock explained the purpose of his visit. I've just returned from Thornfield Manor. James Harrison asked me to deliver this to you personally. He handed her the package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Miss Marple unwrapped it carefully to reveal the Venetian paperweight, the swirled blue and gold glass sphere that had concealed the key to Blackwood's vault. Mr. Harrison thought you might appreciate it as a memento, Dr. Haydock explained. He's selling the manor, you know. Says it holds too many difficult memories. Most thoughtful of him, Miss Marple murmured, turning the paperweight in her hands, watching how it caught the light. A reminder that important things are often hidden where we least expect to find them. Like the truth in this case, Dr. Haydock observed, hidden beneath layers of respectability and academia. Human nature remains consistent, Doctor, regardless of education or social position. The same weaknesses, the same strengths, merely expressed in different ways. Miss Marple placed the paperweight on her mantelpiece. I'm reminded of Tommy Jenkins and the church collection plate. A small theft, by comparison, but the pattern of behavior, the rationalization, the deception, remarkably similar. Dr. Haydock smiled. Your village parallels never cease to amaze me, Miss Marple, though I doubt Inspector Slack appreciates them as I do. Inspector Slack is a good policeman in his way, Miss Marple said charitably. Methodical, thorough, but perhaps too quick to accept the obvious solution. While you see beyond the obvious, Dr. Haydock nodded. A remarkable gift. Chapter 11. Echoes of the past autumn arrived in St. Mary Mead with a palette of amber and gold, transforming the village into a watercolor of russet hues. Miss Marple had just finished preserving the last of her summer berries when the postman delivered a thick cream envelope bearing a London postmark. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant but with a certain boldness that suggested an artistic hand. Inside was an invitation from Lawrence Redding, requesting her presence at the official unveiling of his new exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, a series of paintings titled Justice Deferred, chronicling his grandfather's vindication and the return of the Canterbury Codex. "How very thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured, placing the invitation on her mantelpiece beside the Venetian paperweight where it caught the afternoon sunlight. The telephone rang shortly thereafter. Dolly Bantry, who had received a similar invitation. "We Daverdy simply must go, Jane," she insisted. "Arthur says he'll drive us up for the day. Quite an honor to be invited to such a prestigious event." Miss Marple agreed, though with some reservation about the journey. At her age, London expeditions required careful consideration. Still, there was something about the Blackwood case that remained with her, a sense of connection to the people whose lives had intersected so dramatically with her own. 2 days before the exhibition, Miss Marple received another unexpected visitor. James Harrison arrived at her cottage in a sleek automobile, his manner more relaxed than when she had last seen him, though still carrying himself with the inherent dignity that reminded her so much of his late uncle. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Harrison. Please come in." Over tea served in her best china cups, Harrison explained the purpose of his visit. "I've been sorting through my uncle's papers," he began. "Most will go to various archives and institutions, but I found something I thought might interest you, personally." He withdrew a slim leather-bound journal from his briefcase. "It's Edwin's diary from 1892, the year of the Codex theft." Miss Marple accepted it with careful hands. "Are you certain you wish to share something so private, after all you did to uncover the truth?" "Absolutely." Harrison's expression grew somber. "Besides, I've come to believe that secrets kept too long become poison. My uncle learned that lesson too late." She opened the journal carefully, the leather creaking slightly. Edwin Blackwood's handwriting filled the pages, precise, controlled, yet with occasional passionate flourishes that revealed the complex man behind the disciplined facade. "I've marked a particular entry," Harrison said, indicating a ribbon bookmark. Miss Marple turned to the page and read, "October 17th, 1892. The deed is done. G and H performed their parts admirably. The Codex is now mine, and what a treasure it truly is. Far more significant than even the museum realized. The account of the northern voyage alone could rewrite history, worth every risk, every sacrifice. Browning took the fall, as anticipated. A shame, but unavoidable. One day, perhaps, amends might be made. For now, discretion is paramount." "The northern voyage?" Miss Marple looked up questioningly. Harrison nodded. "That's what makes the Codex truly priceless. It contains a previously unknown account of a 10th-century voyage to North America, predating Leif Erikson by decades. My uncle didn't steal it merely for aesthetic appreciation or scholarly prestige. He believed it would fundamentally alter our understanding of history. Yet he kept this knowledge hidden for 30 years, Miss Marple observed. Power, Harrison said simply. The power to know what others don't. The power to reveal or conceal truth as he saw fit. My uncle was complicated. Most people are, Mr. Harrison. We contain multitudes of contradictions. After Harrison departed, Miss Marple sat with the journal, contemplating this new layer to an already intricate case. Edwin Blackwood. thief, connoisseur, keeper of secrets, and ultimately a man seeking redemption before death claimed him. The day of the exhibition arrived crisp and clear. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry collected Miss Marple promptly at 9, and they made good time to London, arriving at the National Portrait Gallery by early afternoon. The exhibition space was elegantly arranged, with Redding's paintings displayed chronologically, telling the story of the Codex theft and its aftermath. Through a series of portraits and scenes, Miss Marple moved slowly through the gallery, studying each work with care. Redding had captured the dignity and ultimate vindication of his grandfather in a powerful portrait that dominated one wall. Nearby hung a smaller, more intimate painting that caught her attention particularly, a detailed rendering of her own, hands holding the Venetian paperweight, light refracting through the glass to cast blue and gold patterns across her fingers. "My tribute to your insight," came Lawrence Redding's voice behind her. "I hope you don't mind." "It's quite remarkable," she replied, genuinely moved by the unexpected inclusion. "Though I fear my hands appear more elegant in your painting than in reality." "I painted the essence, not merely the surface," Redding smiled, "as you taught me to see beyond appearances." The exhibition was well attended, with museum curators, art critics, and historians mingling among the displays. Miss Marple noticed Eloise Pritchard, deep in conversation with a distinguished gentleman who, according to the whispers around her, was the director of medieval manuscripts at the British Museum. James Harrison stood somewhat apart, watching the Pritchard proceedings with an expression that blended satisfaction and melancholy. When their eyes met across the room, he raised his glass in a silent toast that she acknowledged with a gentle nod. As the afternoon progressed, Redding guided her to a special display case at the center of the exhibition. Inside lay a facsimile of the Canterbury Codex, open to a page showing an intricately drawn map of a coastline. "The Northern Voyage," Redding explained quietly. "The original is now being studied by experts, but I wanted to include this representation. It's the heart of the mystery, after all. The true reason for everything that happened." "Knowledge is a powerful motivator," Miss Marple agreed, "perhaps the most powerful of all, as is the desire to control it." Redding's voice held a new maturity, a hard-won wisdom. "My grandfather understood that. It's why he fought so hard against the accusation that he had been negligent. He knew exactly what had been taken, and why." As the exhibition drew to a close, Miss Marple found herself standing before the final painting, a twilight view of Thornfield Manor, its windows dark except for a single light in what had been Edwin Blackwood's study. The manor appeared both imposing and vulnerable, a repository of secrets now exposed to the world. "What will become of it?" she asked Harrison, who had joined her. "It's been purchased by a heritage trust," he replied. "They plan to open it to the public next year, a museum of medieval literature and artifacts." He smiled faintly. "My uncle would have appreciated the irony." On the journey back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out at the darkening countryside, reflecting on how a single object, a manuscript, a key, a paperweight, could connect so many lives across time and circumstance. The Blackwood case was resolved, yet its implications continued to unfold, like ripples expanding from a stone cast into still water. The Codex had found its way home. Justice, long deferred, had finally been served. And in her village, life would continue its steady rhythm, unchanged on the surface, yet forever enriched by her deeper understanding of the human hearts involved in this singular mystery. "You're very quiet, Jane," Dolly Bantry observed as they neared St. Mary Mead. "Was the journey too tiring?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I was simply thinking about patterns in history, in art, and in human behavior. How they repeat, yet each time with subtle variations that make them new again. Like the next mystery that would inevitably find its way to her door, testing once more her understanding of that most complex puzzle of all, the human soul." Chapter 12. Full Circle. Winter descended upon St. Mary Mead with gentle persistence, dusting the village with frost that glittered in the morning light. Miss Marple, seated by her sitting-room window with a cup of tea, watched as the postman made his methodical way along the lane. Winter had always been a time of reflection for her, the quieter pace of village life conducive to contemplation. The Morning Post brought a newspaper clipping from Dolly Bantry, an article reporting on the sentencing of Victoria Hargreaves and Simon Grant. Both had received substantial prison terms, though less severe than might have been expected due to their cooperation and full confessions. The journalist noted that the pair had provided detailed accounts of the original theft, finally closing one of the British Museum's most notorious unsolved cases. "Justice, at last," Miss Marple murmured, placing the clipping in a small album where she had preserved various mementos of the case: the exhibition invitation, a pressed flower from her garden the day James Harrison had visited, and a sketch Lawrence Redding had sent her of Thornfield Manor in autumn light. The Venetian paperweight still occupied a place of honor on her mantelpiece, catching the winter sunlight in swirls of blue and gold. Miss Marple often found her gaze drawn to it during her knitting, the hidden compartment now a known secret rather than a mystery, yet no less intriguing for that knowledge. A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. It was Eloise Pritchard, wrapped in a fashionable wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm home for Christmas, and wanted to bring you something from London." Miss Marple welcomed her warmly, noting how the young woman carried herself with newfound confidence. Gone was the nervous, uncertain girl who had trembled at Victoria Hargreaves's warnings. In her place stood a poised professional whose expertise was now respected rather than suppressed. "The British Museum has published its first scholarly analysis of the Canterbury Codex," Eloise explained, presenting Miss Marple with an elegant, hardbound volume. "I thought you might like to have a copy, given your role in its recovery." "How very thoughtful, my dear." Miss Marple accepted the book with genuine pleasure. "And your own work, is it progressing well?" "Wonderfully. I've been assigned to the authentication team for a newly discovered collection of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. The techniques I'm developing for dating and verifying provenance might even become standard practice." Her eyes shone with enthusiasm. "None of this would have been possible without you, Miss Marple." "Nonsense," Miss Marple demurred. "You had the knowledge and integrity all along. Circumstances merely allowed them to be recognized." After tea and a pleasant conversation about Eloise's work, the young woman departed with promises to visit again before returning to London. Miss Marple settled back with the scholarly volume, admiring the detailed photographs and transcriptions of the Codex pages. One illustration particularly caught her attention: the map of the northern voyage that James Harrison had mentioned, showing a coastline that scholars now believed represented Newfoundland, along with detailed astronomical observations that allowed for precise dating. The knowledge that had been hidden for so long was now available to all, its historical significance being debated in academic circles worldwide. Edwin Blackwood's selfish concealment had given way to scholarly illumination, an outcome he had finally desired, though his methods had been fatally flawed. Later that afternoon, the vicar called, ostensibly to discuss plans for the Christmas charity bazaar, but clearly eager to share village news. "Thornfield Manor is being prepared for its opening as a museum," he reported. The Heritage Trust has been most thorough in their renovations. They've even preserved Mr. Blackwood's study exactly as it was. A rather macabre touch, if you ask me. History often contains elements of the macabre, Miss Marple observed. We cannot separate the beauty of the past from its darker aspects. Quite so, quite so. The vicar nodded sagely. Oh, and you'll be interested to know that Lawrence, Redding's exhibition is traveling to New York and then to Paris. Quite a triumph for him. The critics are especially impressed by his portrait of his grandfather, calling it a powerful statement on vindication and legacy. After the vicar departed, Miss Marple took a rare evening constitutional despite the cold. The village was peaceful under its mantle of frost, windows glowing warmly against the early darkness. Her path took her past the church, its ancient stones standing sentinel as they had for centuries, witness to countless human dramas, both grand and humble. In the churchyard, she paused before a particular gravestone, not one connected to the Blackwood case, but an older marker bearing the name of a village woman who had died some 15 years earlier. The connection that had helped Miss Marple solve the puzzle of Edwin Blackwood's murder. "Mrs. Jameson," she murmured, "your unfortunate incident with the arsenic weed killer gave me the first inkling about specialized poisons. How curious that even in death we continue to offer lessons to the living." As she turned to leave, her gaze lifted to the distant hill where Thornfield Manor stood against the night sky, a single light burning in what had once been Edwin Blackwood's study. The caretakers preparing for the manor's new role as a museum, no doubt. The following morning brought a surprising telephone call from Inspector Slack. "Miss Marple," he began with unusual cordiality, "I've been asked to consult on a rather peculiar case in Eastbourne. A valuable historical document has gone missing from a private collection under most puzzling circumstances." "Indeed? How interesting! Given your insight during the Blackwood affair, I wondered if you might consider reviewing the particulars of this new case." There was a reluctant but genuine respect in his voice that had not been present during their earlier encounters. "I would be delighted to assist in any way I can, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, allowing herself a small smile at this evidence of professional growth. As Christmas approached, St. Mary Mead was transformed in the customary fashion. Holly and ivy adorning doors, the church prepared for its candlelight service, kitchens fragrant with seasonal baking. Miss Marple received cards from James Harrison, now heading a charitable foundation for historical preservation, Lawrence Redding, whose exhibition continued to garner acclaim, and even a short formal note from Colonel Melchett expressing his hope that she was keeping well. On Christmas Eve, as soft snow began to fall, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the Venetian paperweight in her lap, turning it slowly to watch the light play through the swirled glass. The key it had once concealed had unlocked not only a vault, but a complex web of human relationships spanning decades, ambition and regret, loyalty and betrayal, deception, and, ultimately, truth. The case of the Canterbury Codex had come full circle, from theft to restoration, from injustice to vindication. And she had played her part, as she had in so many village mysteries over the years, applying her understanding of human nature to unravel what others could not. Outside, carolers began their rounds, their voices rising clear and sweet in the Aizu winter night. Miss Marple placed the paperweight back on the mantelpiece and went to fill a tray with mince pies and glasses of sherry for the singers. Life in St. Mary Mead continued its eternal patterns: birth and death, joy and sorrow, mystery and revelation. And Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting and her keen observations, remained its most discerning chronicler, ready for whatever puzzle might next present itself at her garden gate. For in the end, she knew, every mystery was at heart a human one. And human nature, in all its complexity, remained her most enduring study.